Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us from the different place where you are. Welcome to all of you today. This is a webinar. It's an activity of the IPA Communications Committee under the coordination of Mariana Rupertus and the director of Sylvia Wambush. This webinar is being recorded, so those register or who cannot attend online can watch the video later. Let me explain you a little bit about the speaker's opinion are personal and are not institutional position. Well, now that I say this, let me introduce myself. I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Gloria Blanco. I'm an analyst in training with the Australian Psychoanalytical Society. I'm also an In-Soo representative for the 2024 Asia-Pacific Conference that we held in Sydney. My background, I'm a clinical psychologist, but here in Australia, I'm a clinical counselor and a mental health practitioner. I'm associated member of the Queensland Psychoanalytical Psychotherapy Association. Something important about this webinar is like psychoanalysis expressed itself in different societies and cultures. Therefore, adopting a cross-cultural perspective enrich our field and help us to incorporate the richness of the cultural diversity. This webinar aims to disseminate the work to be carried out at the 4th IPA Asia-Pacific Conference, Suffering and Desire Across the Culture, to be held, how I said before, in Sydney, Australia, in May in 2024. Our three keynote speakers, Agatsuma, Vinita, Kshetrapal, and In-Soo, they are speaking in the Asia-Pacific Conference, and today they will share their reflections on the particulars and share the experience that today bring us together as international psychoanalytical community. Before handing over the presentation to our speakers, I will explain briefly how this webinar will function. Well, I'm going to present the three of them, so Agatsuma, Vinita, Kshetrapal, and In-Soo. And after that, we're going a discussion with the three of them, and it's a second session as well, where is the question and answer section. And in this one, people can freely exchange and select questions and ideas with the speakers and attendants. You will find the question box in the right side of your screen. As well, please submit your question from the question and answer session in the bottom of Zoom bar. The questions are anonymous, and the panelists will receive the question and will be able to answer them. Something important about this is like you can post your question throughout the whole course of the webinar from the very beginning, but please remember that the question will not be answered until after completely all the three speaker presentation. You can submit questions to the speaker using the question tab in the control panel, and they can be doing this as soon as they wish. But the question only be answered during the questions and answer session. Okay, another important thing is we're going to have automatic subtitles in English are available. Please press the button in the bottom toolbar that say CC to enable them if you want it. Please the next one. And another important thing, how I say before, remember that this webinar is being recorded and I will be uploaded to the IPA webpage and in YouTube. You will be sent the link to record in this day following the webinar. Participants can only interact through the questions and answers session, how I said before, and chat and microphone functions are not available in the webinar format. Another important thing, please, you must be connected with the name and surname, and otherwise you will be asking to leave the live webinar. Well, now I think now we are ready to begin that listening our speakers. We're going to start with the Dr. So Agatsuma. Dr. Agatsuma is a MD and a PhD. He's a training and supervising analyst of the Japan Psychoanalytical Society. He's a professor in psychiatry and clinical psychology at the Sophia University in Tokyo. He completed his analytical training at the William Ellison White Institute in New York and returned to Japan in 2009. He's now in a private practice in Tokyo and near Osaka. He's a member of the executive committee of GPS, and he's the chair of the public relations committee. He's interested in comparative psychology and psychoanalytical theorizing across culture. He's a board representative from the IPA North America. The title of his presentation is The Unconscious Mind Beyond the Different in Language and Culture. Thank you, Doctor, and welcome. We're so angry to listen to you.
Hello, thank you very much, Gloria, for introducing me. And it is my great pleasure to be here to talk about some of my ideas. I have prepared my paper, which I'm going to read. Engaging with others carries a unique potential. Such encounters are often productive, but they could also be difficult, sometimes fraught with pain. Cultural differences provide clear opportunities to observe otherness, and the differences in language lie at the root of cultural differences. Can we truly think analytically beyond the differences in language and culture? This is a question I would like to think about in this presentation, since I believe that it is of particular importance as psychoanalysis now spreads to wider areas. Personally, this question resonates deeply. My entire upbringing was in Japan, and it was not until my late 20s that I encountered Western psychiatry and psychoanalysis in the United States. My analytic training, well over a decade ago, was a transformative experience for me. However, sometimes the following question arises in my mind, or I'm sometimes asked by others. Is psychoanalysis I practice in Japan the same as that I learned in the United States? I would say my response to this question is affirmative. This comes from my clinical experience. But I think it is also important to think about it theoretically. In his 1997 paper, Some Thoughts on the Use of Language in Psychoanalysis, Thomas Ogden discusses the lifelessness of analytic language. This is very helpful for me in considering the question I have just mentioned. Ogden states that the most common form of lifelessness of analytic language is what is derived from dogmatism and ideological loyalties. He warns against ideological bonds becoming too dominant, because then the analyst would start using the language of his or her analytic school of choice. When this happens, he cautions that the analytic language is no longer alive because the use of the language is then reduced to just conveying to the patient what the analyst already knows as the answers to the questions being raised by the patient. He values instead the analyst's capacity for original thought and the ability to speak with his own voice. This understanding is important for me. Firstly, it serves as a reminder not to fall into ideological thinking in the dogmatic sense that Ogden refers to. In addition, in my case, what Ogden says is important also in another sense. This is because, for me, the language of psychoanalysis might have been cultivated in a context far from my own voice. Consequently, my capacity for original thought may be unknowingly being compromised. I believe the differences in language and culture are distinct from ideological differences. However, in the sense that they're both systems for understanding and digesting phenomena that might be otherwise incomprehensible, language and culture could be as powerful as ideology in shaping our perspectives. Here lies a task. The analyst's ability to speak with his own voice might be a significant issue for those born and educated in cultures vastly different from the West, where psychoanalysis originated. Moreover, this could apply to some extent to all analysts after all, since there is no definitive language and culture of psychoanalysis that is considered to be the one and the only. It might just be a matter of degree. For these reasons, I'm eager to find some answer to whether psychoanalysis can transcend language and culture. While it's not easy to answer, I am considering the following. In addition to the already cited paper by Ogden, I'm aided by the thoughts of several analysts. I am particularly indebted to the discussions of language by Donald Stern's paper in 2002, which discusses words and wordlessness and what he calls the unformulated background of language, as well as by a paper by Timothy Zedes in 2002, which explored in details a hermeneutic perspective in understanding language. In the field of psychoanalysis, I believe that it is better not to consider language in its narrow definition. It is true that we could conceive of language as something like a label to be attached to what already exists in mind, but this is a limited viewpoint. Alternatively, there's the idea that words do not just point to something that already exists, but emerge from relational context. It might be useful to think of a broad matrix that includes both verbal and non-verbal terrains, which is in continuous interactions with the unarticulated terrains. This is the approach proposed by analysts like Stern and Zedes. According to this view, in the background of explicit language, there exists, quote, the vast web of unexpressed and unarticulated meanings, practices, and understandings that remain in the background of explicit awareness and immediate experience, end of quote, by Zedes in 2002. This forms a specific meaning within a given relational context. Reciprocally, these explicit meanings then influence the relational context and the vast web as described. The point is that language and what might be called the background of matrix of fantasies and experiences are mutually influenced and constructed. Culture can be considered to include, or even be, quote, the vast web of unexpressed and unarticulated meanings, practices, and understandings, quote unquote, end of quote, as mentioned. Accepting this, we have to recognize the inseparable relationship between language and culture. This leads to the question, what happens to the language of psychoanalysis when it moves away from the culture in which it was nurtured? How far can it deviate before losing its validity, or does it never lose its validity? I'm relatively optimistic. Based on my limited experience and what I've heard from colleagues, human difficulties have considerable similarities across cultures. Having parents relating to others, living in societies, and having bodily foundations, in the presence or in the absence, are universal aspects of humanity. In Japan, psychoanalysis is called seishin bunseki, and I think psychoanalysis and seishin bunseki are basically the same, and the same methodology can be applied. However, as mentioned, relying solely on empirical evidence feels somewhat insufficient, so we still need theoretical explorations. As I mentioned earlier, I agree with the idea that beneath language, there is a background matrix of fantasies and experiences that gain meaning in a given specific relational context. Considering this, what are the differences in language and culture? Ultimately, I think it is difficult to reduce them to a specific language or cultural style. They can be seen as continuous enactments of some sort in the specific relational context of the background matrix of fantasies and experiences. But it is hard to determine what precedes due to mutual influences. If language and culture are seen as outcomes of a relational context, the original linguistic and cultural background of psychoanalysis is relevant, but not decisive. If language and culture are continuous enactments, encounters between people of different languages and culture could be both a crisis and an opportunity. Such encounters have the potential to turn what was implicit into explicit, providing a crucial step for better self-understanding. In this sense, I hold hope for psychoanalysis. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Doctor. How a beautiful paper. Many things to talking about that and how related is with the conference and the topic of this seminar, Suffering and Desire Across the Culture. Thank you. And later we can go deep with this. But now we're going to continue, and now who's going to present is Vinita Kshetrapal. She's from India. She's a training and supervising analyst with the Indian Psychoanalytical Society. She has presented many psychoanalytical papers in various international conferences, passionately involved in psychoanalysis from the last 35 years. She has been teaching, practicing, and supervising. She has also taught psychology for the 40 years and a prestigious Delphi University institution. Her paper, her presentation, the name is Countersposing the Tadat of the Internal Obstructive Object in the Couple Space, Some Reflections and Innovation. Thank you, Vinita, and welcome. We want to listen to you.
Thank you, Gloria. I'm indeed honored to be here, and I would like to thank Mariano as well as Gloria and the whole team of webinar for thinking of me to be here. It's indeed a privilege and honor. This presentation that's counterposing the tandav of the internal obstructive object in the couple space, some reflections on innovations. This delves into the tandav, a destructive dance of obstructive forces within one partner as an internal object, as played out in the dynamics of a couple. Further, it proposes some new ideas around counterposing this destructive dance in the couple space. Before proceeding further, I would like to clarify two terms used throughout this presentation for the naive audience who are not very well exposed to psychoanalysis. One is internal object and second, obstructive object. An internal object is our psychological and emotional impression of a person. It's the representation that we hold on to when the person is not physically present. An obstructive object is experienced as someone or something actively hostile toward emotional experience, creating an atmosphere of escalating pressure and violence. This is from Google, of course, for the lay people. I will begin by tracing the origins of this obstructive object as described by Bjorn. In his papers on psychosis, Bjorn highlights the presence of the obstructive object in therapeutic settings, particularly in hindering communication between the therapist and the patient. Bjorn also explores how a mother's evasive, avoidant, and disengaging actions around her baby's communication of distress result in denial of projective identifications, consequent lack of containment, and underdeveloped alpha function, which is an emotional digestive function, and meaning. This this obstructive object is environmental to begin with, and combined with the inherited temperament of the infant, later evolves into internal and interpersonal in the couple space. Beyond term, this kind of maternal presence as a willfully misunderstanding mother. I would at the outset like to differentiate three terms used interchangeably in psychoanalytic literature. Projective identification rejecting mother, for example, the mother that slams the door on her crying baby, willfully misunderstanding mother, and the obstructive internal object. In my view, the projective identification rejecting mother is the one that is first experienced. This mother, however, is experienced as willfully misunderstanding to the infant due to several factors. She either does not resonate with the infant's experience or misrepresents the infant's experience, leading to non-verbal confusion. She thus evokes agitation or overwhelmed emotional responses in the infant, such as rage or excessive forceful projective identifications, and closes the door for containment or emotional digestion. Although the infant experiences this mother as willfully misunderstanding, the underlying experience of the mother may be one that is marked by disturbance, confusion, envy, or sadism. This experience is catalyzed by an inability on the part of the mother rather than a willful response. Frequent misrepresentation or refusal by the mother often gets transformed into an internalized sense of identifying with an active no in the infant, compromising his or her sense of spontaneous being. Here on, the mother becomes an obstructive object in the internal world of the growing child. This obstructive object symbolizes denial, rejection, and a big no to growth and learning, thus creating a pervasive atmosphere of terror, pain, and confusion. This atmosphere attacks critical links within the individual, which in turn create a pervasive barrier to communication within the self, ultimately leading to an evasion of all emotional experience and a paralysis of psychological functioning. I would now like to examine the implications of the presence of an internal obstructive object for the couple space and the other partner. Carrying such an internal object can inflict immense frustration and pain on the partner through the playing out of the obstructive object. A lack of emotional intimacy arises from the denial and evasion of emotional reality by the individual carrying the obstructive object, the carrier, projecting his or her own internal struggles onto the healthier partner. This dynamic leads to intense anguish for the healthier partner, who may experience feelings of being targeted, misunderstood, rageful, and despaired. Since these dynamics largely stem from pre-verbal stages, excessive projective identification creates an intense experience of terror, being silenced, inhibition of all initiative and personal agency, and being controlled by the carrier. Confusion prevails due to double-bind communication, which is mutually contradictory messaging, hindering effective communication and emotional growth within the relationship. Blocked contact and communication within the self of the carrier and with the spouse stunts the development and growth of the couple. The spouse is subjected to the obstructive object by the carrier through his or her identification with it. The spouse therefore experiences being misunderstood so blatantly that it's experienced as a shock, rage, and humiliation, leading to a stunned silencing and annihilation of being. The evaluative aspect of the obstructive object further fosters criticism in the couple space. Every thought or action is deemed inappropriate or incorrect in the eyes of the obstructive object as lived out by the carrier. Moral high ground supersedes emotional experience. This creates a sense of paralysis and extreme inhibition in the spouse. Often due to excessive narcissism, the carrier seeks oneness in his or her distortion. There's a strong pull by the carrier inviting the spouse to join the pathology. The carrier's narcissistic fusion with the other does not allow any space for the spouse to be or for the spouse's stirring. Superficially, these phenomena seem to be motivated by the destructive impulses of the carrier that appear as primary aggression. The real motivation, however, is often an unconscious, frantic search for a helping object to transform pain into comfort. If not found, the violence of projection intensifies. Excessive projective identification by the carrier manages the evacuation of pain, communication of distress, control of the object through invasive fantasy, and attacks on the other's mental apparatus. The freedom to dream oneself and dream the other is compromised, thereby blocking learning. The couple space becomes opposed to learning, and the failure to learn becomes critical for continuing the marriage. This disrupts the potential of creativity and personal and couple dynamic realizations, favoring aggressive acting out evacuations unmediated by reflective thought. The core of emotional learning is disrupted, leading to an orbit of circularity in the couple. At this point in the presentation, I would like to go over a few novel thoughts as counters to the obstructive object. Firstly, facilitating the partner towards becoming the projective identification welcoming object. The first stage of response to the obstructive object as played out by the carrier often involves feeling misunderstood, hurt, or rageful, or feeling the impulse to leave and give up. In other words, the playing out of the obstructive object is experienced as directed against oneself personally. Therefore, the question arises how to tolerate the distress evoked and become the projective identification welcoming object and dreaming subject again. The first step I hypothesize towards achieving this state is to step back from a sense of personal attack and to see the assault as a communication to make the other taste a sense of the carrier's internal world. Only when we begin to see it as primarily an attempt to communicate a difficult, non-verbal emotional experience on the part of the carrier, can we turn towards at-one-ment with the other's experience. This is the movement in the healthier partner that we seek to facilitate. Eaton describes this shift in himself beautifully. The aim here, according to Eaton, is to effect soothing at the somatic level. Since that is what a containing mother accomplishes for the infant, she does this by evoking the vitality of her own projective identification, welcoming objects, rather than slamming the door on living through and transforming the distress in herself and the other. The resultant at-one-ment must be communicated back unsaid via a non-verbal mode to the carrier. The insistence on verbal communication needs to be given up in a couple space due to a hatred of emotional discourse on the part of the carrier. Language between partners need to shift from verbal and conscious to non-verbal and unconscious, as is the language of projective identification. The second novel thought is therapy by proxy. The internal obstructive object, in its all-pervasive no to all growth-oriented initiatives, blocks seeking therapy in most cases. The person carrying the obstructive object thus keeps himself or herself outside the scope of psychoanalysis. In such circumstances, I suggest therapy by proxy through the partner who may be more receptive. Freud had experimented with this idea in the case of Little Hans. This will, of course, involve three-pronged therapy with the healthier partner, a therapeutic focus on the healthier partner, a focus on couple dynamics, and a focus on the obstructive object carrying partner. Third, and so will be helpful in this, AMI as a counter to the obstructive internal object. While thinking about the counter, the Japanese description of phenomenon of MA derived from Amaru comes to my mind. I hope I'm pronouncing these terms correctly. The various associations and meanings of MA include to depend and presume upon another's love or bask in another's indulgence with no connotations of inferiority or subordination. It also refers to a content state of mind with a sense of reciprocated love. It implies an insistence on a non-verbal mode of communication, enabling the infantile origin being accessible to consciousness and a movement to merge with an object emotionally. This is by Doi. Going to the lexical source for ME, Daijenkai, as quoted by Taketomu, one can add playfulness with a corresponding release with restraint to the association. Here I am suggesting satisfying MA for the carrier of obstructive object as a counter. The empirical support for MA as a counter to the obstructive object as played out in the couple space comes from experimental studies on subliminal tachistoscopic exposure to the messages of merger with the mother. These studies provide evidence for strong unconscious wishes for a state of merger with the good mother of early childhood. These wishes, when gratified through subliminal, and I would like to add nonverbal here, communication, leads to improvements. Although these studies found improvements in patients with a differentiated sense of self, I also see these as evidence supporting my hypothesis by extension. Further, I think of experiencing MA as symbolized in Japanese ukiyo-e paintings, including those involving a mother and a child viewing a third aesthetic object in nature together, described in Kitayama's study. With this association, I'm suggesting that the non-verbal aesthetic experiencing of an object by the couple is facilitative of healing. Fourth is play as a counter. Play has been thought of as a kind of dreaming in psychoanalytic literature. Dreams are now seen as aiding emotional working through. Additionally, play is at a sufficient distance from I-ness and emotional consciousness as in a dream. Given these characteristics, play emerges as a reasonable counter to the resistance to emotional thinking for the carrier of the obstructive object. Besides dissolving the resistance to thinking about one's faulty emotional patterns, Given these characteristics, play emerges as a reasonable counter to the resistance of emotional thinking for the carrier of the obstructive object. Besides dissolving the resistance to thinking about one's faulty emotional patterns, it encourages different strategies of emotional thinking and encountering and adapting to different emotional situations. This play could involve board games, cards, or any other games that involve strategizing. Playing together by the couple often dissolves the obstructive object. To conclude, I have these 4 lines, somewhat poetic. In the intricate dance of obstructive forces, love's path obscured, communication divorces, yet with empathy's embrace, healing ensues, transforming Tandav to tender, heartfelt hues. Thank you so very much for being patient, listeners. Thank you, Gloria, and thank you for the screen sharing.
Thank you, Vinita. Really appreciate your paper and many things to talk as well after, many concepts and ideas to people can do the questions and we talk after. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the last one, but not the last important, is the Dr. In-Soo Lee. Welcome, Doctor. Let me introduce the Dr. In-Soo Lee. He's a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He's in a faculty and the supervising analyst and the Korean Psychoanalytical Center. His analytical training in the US sparked a profound interest in exploring the impact of Korean culture on individual psychology. According to the interest in 2017, he has published the book, Even If No One Else Approves Me, A Journey for Finding a Free Self, with his father, Dr. In-Soo Lee. Well, Doctor, thank you. And the paper he's going to present, give me a second, is the name. I think you can put a little bit down his CV, please, Mariano. Sorry to see the paper. No? Okay. Sorry, Doctor. The name of your, no. Well, okay. Doctor, you can introduce, I don't have in this moment, so sorry, the name of your paper, sorry. But welcome, and we want to listen to you.
Thank you for introduction, Gloria.
Welcome.
My title of my presentation is Confucian Culture and Its Discontents. And I will share my screen with you.
Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, I'm very honored to have this opportunity to present to you how Korean culture, especially Confucian culture, has influenced the psychological characteristics and suffering of Koreans. I hope that this discussion will facilitate comparative studies of cross-cultural psychodynamics in the Asia-Pacific region and with other regions too. Throughout past century, Koreans have endured diverse hardships and vulnerabilities, shaping a collective identity. The deep pain has permeated into various aspects of modern Korean society, influencing our cultural identity profoundly. The film Oasis and Parasite, and the novel The Vegetarian, and the BTS song Spring Day depict the emotional suffering in Korea. As of 2022, South Korea holds the highest suicide rate among OECD countries for 17 consecutive years. It's disheartening that one person dies by suicide every 30 minutes. Suicide is the leading cause of death among teenagers. To understand the dramatic duality experienced by Koreans, it's essential to grasp the cultural dynamics that create, reinforce, and sustain such sacrifices, which have been made for South Korea's remarkable growth. From a psychoanalytic perspective, it's evident that traditional Korean culture, especially Confucian culture, still exerts a powerful influence on psyche of Koreans. As Freud explored the conflict between instinct and the demands of civilization in his work, Civilization and its Discontents, I aim to elucidate the influence of Confucian culture on the psyche of Koreans by offering a more detailed explanation. Confucianism. In East Asia, Confucianism has had the deepest impact on shaping social norms, family structures, and dynamics within local communities. At its core, Confucianism prioritizes family, considering it the fundamental unit for maintaining harmony and continuity within human communities and the nation. Among East Asia countries, South Korea stands out as the most Confucian-centered society. Today, Korean families and society are undergoing more egalitarian changes, with many traditional customs disappearing. However, the core values of Confucianism, especially concerning human relationships and ethical standards, still persist. Koreans typically establish relationships after confirming the age, gender, and social status of the person they first meet, and then they act accordingly towards the other person. Traditional forms of Confucianism adhere to strict authoritarianism, inherently forming a hierarchical societal structure. The concept of samgang, the 3 bonds, and oryun, the 5 relationships, encapsulates Confucian ideals within human relationships. Confucianism promotes a positive attitude toward the world, emphasizing discipline, self-cultivation, respect for authority, frugality, and strong familial bonds. The Confucian system granted almost absolute legal authority to men and rulers, while minimizing the rights of women and children, and in some cases, they were virtually non-existent. The class structure was strictly hierarchical, making it extremely difficult to transcend class boundaries. There was a clear division of roles between the internal and external aspects of the household, with women responsible for their home, men for external affairs. Particularly, strict separation of boys and girls from the age of 7 was enforced. The picture I show is the 2 different parts of the traditional Korean house. The upper one is the sarangche, which is the husband stays. And the lower one is the anche, is the woman and children live there. So there is this internal, external division, very clear division in the family. The value systems of its members remain fundamentally the same, universally maintained, with clear and strict adherence to etiquette and ethical norms. Deviation is severely punished while compliance is rewarded. In Confucian societies, there is a clear distinction between what is considered normal or abnormal. Within authoritarian cultures, ambiguity is detested, and clear actions are preferred. As a result, there is a tendency to quickly conform through action, making it difficult to utilize rational judgment and leading to succumbing to emotional pressures. Confucian authoritarianism dictates that individuals must continuously submit to authority figure based on age, gender, and social status. Within this hierarchy, passive dependency is an inevitable emotion that persists throughout life. The absolute dominance of authority figures always instills fear in those beneath them. Conversely, experiences and expressions of aggression are culturally strongly suppressed. Filial piety prohibits children from expressing anger towards their parents and demands that any hostility towards parents be dissociated from consciousness. Suppressed resentment was sometimes expressed in sadomasochistic dynamics as intense anger towards the couple, children, or others, and sometimes the rage was murderous. Hierarchical Confucian societies offer psychological rewards for passivity, especially the inner sense of security that one's fate is determined by an all-powerful, benevolent authority figure is the greatest reward. Korean society is ultimately built upon the ideal of a benevolent father figure, akin to how a young child might regard their parents as godlike beings, all-powerful and protective. This image often manifests in therapy situations as idealizing transference. In Korean culture, the father holds the strongest authority and legal power within the family, but often distances himself from family issues as much as possible. Typically, fathers minimize involvement in family matters. In modern Korea, fathers are increasingly embracing caregiving roles and publicly expressing warmth and affection in public places. However, due to the legacy of previous generations, fathers often feel it appropriate to remain strict and emotionally distant figures, responsible for providing for the family. Both boys and girls growing up in Korea often experience the emotional absence of their fathers within the family, leading to a longing for the idealized father figure, known as father hunger. Father hunger refers to a neurotic longing for an idealized father figure who can fulfill the child's psychological needs. While all Confucian societies are male-centered, within home, mother typically assumes the primary role. She manages the household and raises the children with caregiving, supervision, and discipline. The most primary emotional bond exists not between husband and wife, but between mother and son, a relationship that continues from one generation to next. Mothers often provide the comfort and devotion that their husband may not offer, especially to their sons, particularly the eldest. As a result, mothers tend to remain the most significant female figure in their son's life throughout their lifetime, creating a classical Oedipal situation. Sons may consequently experience significant internal conflicts, which often remain unresolved. Korean mothers and sons are likely to have dissociated incest fantasies. Incest is an absolute taboo in Korean culture, but this fantasy is deeply repressed, and women often want love from their children rather than their husbands. Their sons experience sexual fantasies about older women and the castration anxiety that comes with it. At the same time, this repressed incest desire serves to strongly tighten the relationship between mothers and sons. Mothers in traditional Korean society were very possessive of children of all ages, especially sons. They use a variety of manipulative strategies to maintain control. Mothers portray themselves as weak, helpless, and suffering, causing their children to feel guilty for not meeting their needs. This castrating maneuver causes the children to feel incompetent, helpless, frustrated, and angry, and at the same time, hesitant to resist the frightening and powerful mother. In particular, what Winnicott calls the fear of a woman is an important unconscious fantasy that exists in both men and women and can manifest as cruelty, hatred, or excessive conformity and submission towards women. Confucian parenting fosters a harsh superego, internalizing a dichotomous absolutism. As a result, it emphasizes clarity while harboring a disdain for ambiguity and uncertainty. Also, individuals were not viewed as independent selves, but rather as a part of a larger us. The Confucian ideal of the complete self was primarily defined based on observable external behaviors. In order to become the ideal person desired by others, individuals had to simultaneously address conflicting demands. And compartmentalization, in severe cases dissociation, became the solution to this. However, by emphasizing conformity to external norms and standards over focusing on internal experiences and emotions, there can be a disconnection between the conscious self and the unconscious mental realm. This impedes the experience of creating and discovering the self and others within the transitional space. Consequently, it creates difficulty in individuation and development of autonomous self. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Beautiful presentation. I have to say thank you to the three of you. This has been a wonderful opportunity to gain insight from the psychoanalytical perspective with Vinita, Dr. Soo, Dr. In-Soo, how the three of you connect the culture, history, language, psychoanalysis, thinking of the region. And I think it's so important for people around the world know more about Asia-Pacific region and the way and the culture. Yes, I think it's a unique and enriching opportunity for all of us. Now we're going to start with the exchange between us, and as well, then we go into the questions and answer section. I don't know if each of you they want to say something else or do any comment related to the other papers of your college. Welcome and welcome everyone to continue doing questions that I already see there are a few. Yeah.
Well, I have something to say in response to In-Soo's presentation and also So's presentation. While listening to them and reading their papers, we had the readings yesterday, so I went through the readings. I would like to say to In-Soo Lee that, I was completely able to identify with the Indian culture as he spoke about the Korean culture. The hierarchy, the intense involvement between mothers and sons. In fact, Dr. Sudhir Kakkar has spoken about a phenomenon that he calls maternal enthrallment in response to this close investment and intense investment in the mother-son bond. And he's spoken about three paradoxes of maternal enthrallment, that in such a situation, there is a desire to get away from the mother on the son's part, as well as the fear of separation. That has been found to be the case in India. There's longing for the mother that he hates, and there is incestuous desire with near incestuous experiences combined with the terror triggered by assertive female sexuality. And these paradoxes that we come upon in Indian men, they lead to sexual inhibitions and dysfunctions much more than the perversions, revealed in Western culture. So I wanted to ask you, what is your experience around this maternal enthrallment? Because you said that this leads to a classical Oedipal complex in Taiwan, in Korea, sorry. But I was wondering that, despite Oedipal complex being classical and sort of universal, there have been some cultural variations that have been found post Freud. And I have a feeling that it is not classical Oedipal complex because certain dimensions of the Oedipal complex are far more bright than certain other dimensions. For instance, the mother-son bond is far too strong, creating its own inhibitions. I wonder whether this has implications for the erotic life, sexual life of the couples, and how does it manifest in South Korea?
Yes, I think that is very interesting question and also very important question. But I don't know I have the answer to your question. But the one thing that comes to my mind is that the compared to other cultural societies or other cultures, I think the incest is extremely prohibited in Korean culture. For example, when I search for some myth or oral tradition that depict or express this son-mother incest or daughter-father incest and so on, I cannot find the direct representation of that kind of dynamics. But we find that, yes, we find that the siblings, like a brother, sister, or cousin, uncle, that's sometimes appear in our myth or other oral tradition. So I think maybe the Confucian ideal, especially this kind of very hierarchical, patriarchal culture, extremely suppress in the males erotic feelings toward their mothers or
Also
incest.
towards women? Also towards women?
Also, yes, also women, yes. But nowadays, I find that Korean people, especially the younger generation, is much more active, pursuing sexual pleasure. And especially the females are much more active compared to in the past generations. So there is a big changes in terms of sexuality. So that's the thoughts I have.
Yeah, which we can kind of attribute to globalization and media exposure, films,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yes.
the modern experience. But I have a feeling even when they go in for far more sexual exploration and experimentation, the body somehow still feels like a slave to the earlier notion. So they may be having very frequent sex partners and so on, but their bodies do not participate as freely as they ought to given these internal inhibitions.
Mm. Mm. And I have some thoughts about the source paper. The source paper was highly intriguing to me because, like so, I underwent psychoanalytic training in the US rather than Korea and experienced linguistic and cultural barriers and challenges like what he described. So these cultural differences actually helped me to discern more clearly the influence of Korean culture that had taken for granted. So while we may have a strong sense of our belonging to a culture, we often struggle to define it precisely because it is so deeply embedded in our lives. So I also very much interested in So's idea about having the original voice, because sometimes I have also similar struggle. My culture, psychoanalytic culture, and having the integrated culture and so on. So can you tell us about your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much for your comment. I can really understand. And I feel the same. I share your thoughts and feelings about the encountering another cultural context. I think it presents when you are immersed in the same kind of cultural atmosphere. Sometimes it gets bit difficult based on what kind of assumptions you're functioning, thinking, and feeling. But in that sense, being exposed to another cultural context like you experience and I have experienced, and everybody to some extent experiences, it can poses a sort of a kind of a crisis, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to think about where we are coming from. And I think I found into your presentation about Confucian culture quite interesting because I feel that to some extent, but probably Confucianism in Japan is not as it's kind of diluted probably a little bit than it is in Korea, but I can just understand what it is, and it's an example by seeing a different culture. I see where my thinking is coming from. I realize, well, this has to do with Confucianism. Maybe that does not have to do with, maybe that's more derived from Western influence in Japan, but it is derived from Confucianism, that sort of things. And also, I thank Vinita for exploring the Maya concept, which, is very, and also you, I think, mentioned a possibility of applying Maya concepts to different cultural context, which I thought was quite interesting. And thank you very much.
Thank you, So. I also have some comments or some thoughts running through my mind. I think both the presentations I found to be very interesting. And I thought there was a kind of a common denominator where we were talking about the dialectic of universals versus cultural specificity. So I would say that there is a universal psychoanalytic language that we kind of adhere to, and yet we take it to be in a very personal realm whereby wherever we kind of convert it into a feeling language, which is a language of achievement, as Beyond calls it, language of achievement being the emotional language, whereby it's no longer that deadened language of psychoanalysis or theoretical idioms. It becomes a very personal language of the moment, which is emotional, which is taking into account the emotional climate of the moment in the session. So, of course, we are all touching upon this cultural versus universal dialectic, and we are probably placed on different places on this continuum. And yet, I think the ultimate goal is to make it your very own, your very emotional, affective language for the moment. So it was really nice listening to it. And I thought that was a very important issue when you picked up on lifelessness of analytic language. That was a very important point because I completely believe in this saying by Beyond that all the sessions should be and interpretation should be a surprise for the patient and the analyst alike. It should be a new thought. It should be a surprise, which is what makes it very, very personal moment. I don't know if I've been clear in what I'm trying to convey, but
Yes, very
that's
much.
what I thought.
I fully agree with you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and as well, Doctor, so you say there are cultural different provide clear opportunity to observe others, but as well you say in your presentation that this about the language open a crisis, but as well a hope, because it's true, it's a globalization around, and it's about as well thinking not just how thinking the another one is in the session, how thinking and psychoanalysis think. For example, today, the four of us, we speak in English. That is not our mother tongue, but we hear and communicate it. And a little bit what Vinita said, what mean the language. She talked about being, and as well, there are other analysts like Lacan. They say the structure of the psyche is based off the language, but the meaning that is behind. And I think, and I think it's related your paper and Dr. In-Soo paper as well. And with Vinita, just one question. Is like how this innovation that you're talking about games in that encounter, in a way is so, you put in from psychoanalytical perspective that is true. People who working with kids is there, the toys. And I remember an analyst one day say, that person say that they have a toys in the room, and one day someone asking or want to play, I'm not sure. But that is a different approach that you put in your paper. How is this perspective for you? This is so innovation in a way, what you said.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Gloria. What I would want to say is that when I talk about the person carrying obstructive object as an internal object, I am referring to a very, very strong inhibition, negation to all growth-oriented activities. And these kinds of people cannot tolerate any emotional discourse. So, in order to make them reflect on their own thinking processes, introspect on their own processes, it's really important to catch them on an optimum distance from their own direct emotionality. So to me, and play provides that for children. We've used play for children in psychoanalysis for so many years. Klein used it, many others have used it. So, to my mind, this kind of a person represented psychologically a child who had been frustrated in terms of his projective identifications not being received. And I thought that this is a very indirect kind of method for him or her to reflect on his thinking patterns, feeling patterns. So when it comes to games, they are often able to focus on how self-defeating they're becoming in the way they are playing, you know,
Mm.
and that's how they can approach that self-defeating thought process. Or you know, they start integrating emotions in a very slow manner, but through play, because it's sufficiently distant from their I-ness, which they can't tolerate to talk about.
Mm.
So that's how I came upon it.
Thank you, Vinita. Thank you. Now we're going to pass to the question and answer section, that there are a few questions. The first one, they asking about, perhaps it is an illusion that anyone ever speak the same language as another. It can be an advantage not to understand. It leaves more possibilities open. It seems paradoxical to say that it's better not to understand, but perhaps our desire to understand is a way of avoid suffering. What is your opinion about this question?
So would you want to talk
yes,
about it?
yes. I agree with the questioner. I think it's, you know, as it is often talked about in clinical psychoanalysis, to understand something the patient said that easily, we have to be careful about the ease, the very ease that we feel we have understood something. And that reminds me of, you know, the Bion, I believe, said to James Goldstein during his analysis, please do not understand, please superstand, or please whatever stand, but please do not understand very easily. That comes into my...
Yes. Wonderful.
Yes.
I would also want to say something in response to this. I do feel that while verbal language, of course, differs across cultures, and that's also a resource, because I learned from MI in Japan. So there are specific words that you don't find a parallel in English for. And it's a resource that we have different language, because the non-verbal or the emotions, they are always escaping a precise description. So we are always hinting around them, the non-verbal being the common denominator for all cultures, the body being the common denominator for all cultures. And I think having different languages and trying to learn from different cultures and different languages, we can actually try and I know it's not going to be successful, but we can try to articulate whatever is escaping our articulation, which is happening much more than the articulation that's possible. So there is the common denominator of non-verbal that we can try from various perspectives, various cultures, various languages, to try and make it more coherent, more understandable, more articulable, and yet we will fail in the striving. That is, of course, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have another questions. The second one say, the early separation of the mother is stronger than the Asian societies. Would you agree with this? And does this at the same time result in a devaluation of females?
Sorry, could you repeat the first part?
Yes. The early separation of the mother is strong than in the Asian society. Would you agree with this, that is stronger in the Asian society or region than in another society? And that person say, At the same time, do you think is the result in a devaluation of female?
Well, I would look at these two very differently. First of all, I don't think there is a stronger separation from the mother in Asian societies. Quite on the contrary, breastfeeding goes on for longer in Asian societies, at least in India, goes on for a long, long time. So I don't think the separation is very severe or early in Asian societies. In fact, the mother-child bond is rather strong with a lack of separation in Asian societies. Well, so I don't know if any other panelist would want to comment on this. In-Soo or So?
Yes, I also have the similar opinion. In Korean culture, separation is much more later, especially the mother-child, and the breastfeeding also, like Vinita mentioned, is more prolonged. So there is less strict separation between mother and child from the early age. So especially sometimes children sleep together with their parents or especially mother.
Yes.
But
I
also
think,
you said, sorry, yes,
no,
Sue?
well, I was going to say, in Japan too, I think the answer to the question depends on what the questioner means by early separation, but my sense is that separation is not early in Japan either. I think maybe it comes later if any, and I don't think it doesn't lead to devaluation of females. I think females deemed to have maybe a little different roles and meanings in Japan or compared to in Western countries, but I don't think it does not necessarily mean a devaluation or anything.
Yes, I also agree with that, especially in Korean culture. Females are socially discriminated, but in the house, they are most powerful person. So mothers are very powerful. So that's a very drastic contrast.
Okay, they have another question here. This person said, the incest fantasy offer a further thought on ornament and atonement, bringing together both a fantasy of taboo, unity, and consequent guilty. Is the fantasy of the mother-child union a fantasy of return to a prenatal state?
Would you like to respond, In-Soo?
So I have difficulty understanding the question itself, but
Okay. We could
yes.
ask her to repeat it, Gloria.
Yes. Well, they're talking about a little bit about the taboo, about the fantasy of the mother and child, and that person really, the question is, if the fantasy of the mother-child union as a fantasy of return to a prenatal state. I think they think because in an adult they continue this and it's a way to return to an earlier stage. I think is that what person asking.
Yes, it's a very important question, and I think one thought came to my mind is the narcissistic regression. So where the person have enormous difficulty experiencing loss, so they defend their self by regression to belonging and denying the loss. So I think in that regard, some people in Korean society struggle with this issue. They are having difficulty experiencing loss and mourning. So they tend to seek the omnipotent symbiotic relationship, which is maybe denying the separateness of the other. So I think this question reminds me of that kind of regression. When one person tolerates the loss or separateness, they can love the other person. But some people want to have this symbiotic relationship. So that's what I have in my mind.
That is painful when they are an adult. They didn't do when there was a child in a good way. So interesting. Well, there are another question. I think this is for Vinita. They ask in Vinita, would you consider the obstructive internal object as a defense against an unbearable dependency?
No, I think when it comes, of course, Beyond talks about the temperament of the individual as an infant as a very important factor. So he says that we are born with a temperament, and in the initial stages, sometimes our frustration tolerance is of a very low order. So as infants, we can't tolerate frustration at all. And that in combination with the projective identification rejecting mother leads to the development of internal obstructive object. So I won't call it dependency. I would like to call it that, the baby is born with certain difficulties, say with excessive envy or with excessive intolerance of frustration, which when combines with uncontaining maternal difficulties leads to obstructive object. I don't see it as a defense against dependency. I don't. It's a very interesting question, yes.
Well, we just have 8 minutes for finish. I don't know if you want to add something else, say something else for the people who listen to you. Yes, the final words.
I have here, can I mention a particular question too?
Please.
Okay, I see.
Please.
One question is, I think the person asks whether the Japanese language, because it tends to allude things not so explicitly, how is it in analytic session? I think that's the question. In the sense, I think when I see Japanese patient, whether I do some special consideration or not when I see a Japanese patient, the answer is no and yes. No, in the sense that because analysis it's all about not necessarily making implicit explicit all the time, but it's a relation between explicit things and implicit things. So we have to be always, regardless of the language being used, I think we have to be careful about what is explicit and what is implicit. So in that sense, it's not necessarily that everything tends to be implicitly implied in Japanese sessions, no. But yes, in the sense that I think, for example, patients don't call me you, for example. Instead, they would call me Agatsuma. Sensei, it's a kind of respectable form. But what does that mean? It's hard to really tell my patients, no, instead of calling me Agatsuma Sensei, which is like Dr. Agatsuma, call me you. It's hard to do that for some reason. And the very reason why it is difficult needs to be explored. But I think that similar things could happen in another cultural and linguistic context. So I just wanted to give a small example. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Something else?
Yes, very few people call me doctor, despite the fact that I'm a PhD and a psychoanalyst. Mostly they call me ma'am. And if they call me by my first name, it's a little jarring, I would say, culturally speaking.
Interesting. I think it's very interesting, even alluding to Alice could, demand a special walk even.
Yes, that's a good idea, I think.
Mhm, mhm.
But I really wonder if we can take away the hierarchy implicit in analyst, analyze, and relationship. Like in a parent-child relationship, we can't take it away.
Well, we're almost in the end of this pressure seminar. I have to say thank you really to Vinita, So, and
Thank
In-Soo.
you.
We really appreciated your papers, your thoughts, your insight. Thank you, really. And I have to say thank you to everyone for your participation. Thank you to you all for joining us and for your valuable contributions. I would like to remind you that the Asia-Pacific Congress will take place on May the 2nd and 4th in the city of Sydney. And our speakers today, they will be here and you can interact with them as you coming to Australia for the Asia-Pacific Conference. And we look forward to see you here. And as well as coming a next seminar, IPA webinar, but that's going to be in Spanish. If there are some people that speak Spanish, they are welcome. The name is Desafíos para la Intimidad en Psychoanalysis. It's going to be presented for Andres Russo, and the moderator will be Mariano Rupertus. Thank you, and I really want to meet you in person, Vinita, In-Soo Lee, and Dr. Soo. Really, see you soon here in Australia. Bye, everyone. Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Gloria.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.